Welcome to the Oncology Journal Club podcast, a dynamic and engaging learning resource for medical professionals. I'm your producer, Rachel Babin from the Oncology podcast. Joining you today are your hosts, Professor Craig Underhill, Dr. Kate Clarke, and Professor Christopher Jackson.
G'day. Before we get into this episode, everybody, I just want to thank you all for listening. We're doing a special episode today on diversity, equity, inclusiveness. Since we recorded this episode, this has continued to be a hot issue. The New York Times published an article about words that have been flagged as needing to be limited or avoided on government documents and grant applications. These are words such as activism, belonging, bias, equity, minority, social justice, socioeconomic status, all sorts of seemingly innocuous words. Male and female should be avoided as well. So we're really in an era of censorship. And so I hope you enjoy the discussion, think about it, and we'd really love it if people could give us some feedback, either directly or via our social media. Thank you so much for listening.
For further information, head to the show notes at oncologynetwork.com.au. The Oncology Journal Club is proudly produced by the Oncology Network podcast team. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started.
Welcome to another episode of the OJC. Dr. Clarke, how are you?
Oh, kia ora, Craig. Always lovely to see you and Chris, but gutted at the dross coming out of Congress this afternoon.
Yeah. Chris, are you depressed?
Kia ora koutou. Look, I'm just burying my head in the sand at the moment, actually, Craig. I think it's a good time to be off social media. It's a good time to be off the news websites. I think, I really like my life. I've got a lovely old life here in Dunedin, New Zealand. I've got great friends, great workplace, great patients, wonderful life. But as soon as I turn on the television or social media, I get very, very, very sad. So I think I'll just go back to my nice little happy life bubble.
Yeah, is that what we should do, though? Because I've been talking to my family about this, and friends and family say, I just can't stand watching news anymore. But my take is that it's probably even more important to try and keep up with the news and actually speak out about it. I don't know, because we won't have a happy life if we just retreat into our bubbles. I don't know, discuss.
Yeah, well, I think that's the big topic for today's podcast, isn't it? I mean, I think that the ability to retrench and avoid the news is probably the sign of ultimate privilege, whereby if you can avoid the impact of the news because it's not impacting on you day to day, that's because you are insulated from it. And at some point, you do have to make a principled stand. I do think, however, the constant onslaught of insanity can be overwhelming. And I'm a great believer in picking your battles, work out where you can best contribute, and do so in that way.
Kate, thoughts on avoiding the news or engaging?
Look, I think it's very much like watching a car crash, and I just can't look away. I don't have Christmas discipline. I turned it off multiple times this afternoon, and then had to go back to it. It's like, just what's he going to say next? But it's surreal. It feels like a dystopian novel. That's the bit that
that's right, and it's happening, right? And it's all evolved in the last month. It's quite shocking. I kind of look at the news before I go to sleep and go, oh my God, this just said what? And then you wake up, in the morning and have another look and you go, oh my God, he just said a whole lot more. And sometimes it's actually bat flipping on what he'd said the day before. So it is really shocking. So we did want to talk about some of the recent issues in the US today. So it's a bit of a deviation from our normal format, because I think it is important we say something about diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And some of the journals have published opinion pieces about this, and we'll mention some of those and refer to some of those. But, I think this is our little opportunity to protest and support our colleagues in the US. I came across a Nature paper, and you can click on the link to that. Trump 2.0, an assault on science anywhere is an assault on science everywhere because of the global interconnectedness. So, we can't, I think, isolate ourselves in Australia and New Zealand and the rest of the world from what's going on in the US. I think our science and our research community will be the same because, we're all involved in a global effort to improve cancer outcomes. And so there will be a ripple consequence to what's going on. I think this article sort of summarized quite well what's gone on since Trump was sworn in and some of the attacks on science and some international organizations and initiatives. So that's summarized in there, the attacks on the National Institute of Health, WHO, the CDC, Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so it goes on with, NIH grants suspended. They're unable to communicate. They can't attend meetings. We'll touch on that in a minute. Freezing US aid, the US Agency for International Development, which is like their soft diplomacy counter against China, and vital funding for preventative and treatment programs in mostly lower income countries, which will have, massive ramifications in those countries and consequences for the global economy. But I love the summary, which was Nature, written by the Nature editorial staff. Nature's mission is to serve scientists through prompt publication of significant advances in any branch of science and to provide a forum for the reporting and discussion of news and issues concerning science. For much of our 155-year history, the US has been a global leader in research, including in its provision of funding for education and training in science, to the great advantage of itself and the wider world. With the changes now underway, the new administration seems to be inclined to recklessly consign that to history. We at Nature denounce this assault on science, and we encourage the global research community, wherever they can, to voice their opposition. This is our little attempt, I guess, to voice our opposition, support our international colleagues, as I said, and we'll certainly hope that everyone will share this podcast where they can on social media, and we'll certainly push it with our US colleagues, many of whom have kindly appeared on the podcast over recent years. We really appreciate them doing that. And so through this episode and that effort to push it out, we hope to support them and really not bury our heads in the sand about this.
Kia ora, Craig. I feel very much like it's really important that we do say something because we can. Many of our colleagues in the States can't for very good reason. And I genuinely think people don't understand what we are going to lose. So it is not just flash research organizations, it's libraries, it's archives, it's museums, it's the Environment Protection Agency, it's the ability to coordinate on climate change projects, on anti-poverty programs. It's contraceptive care for millions of women internationally, which, as you know, affects health outcomes. Terrifying. Chris?
Well, I feel like we can't just have a podcast. We will just sit here and agree with each other. So maybe I have to play the devil's advocate here. Let me just start by saying I really love the USA. I mean, I think their contributions to science and medicine have been absolutely and utterly without comparison. The NIH has been the founder of first-in-class molecules which have taken our field forward, platinum drugs, testicular cancer, ASCO, obviously major global organization, NIH, what it's funded over the course of many years. America has more than pulled its weight in the international community in terms of contributions to WHO over many, many years. And of course, more recently, Biden with his cancer moonshot as well, again, redoubling efforts on cancer. We would never have had the Pfizer COVID vaccine so quickly in the end of a global pandemic had it not been for changes in regulations in the US that actually led to the acceleration of vaccine development, for example. So we have an awful lot to be thankful to the US for. I think also with that, we have to note that the US is imperfect. As Obama was fond of saying, it was the imperfect union, and that America was a work in progress, and that history was not linear, and that there were ups and downs. And it feels to me at the moment, from my own personal perspective, divorced from the country, of course, that it feels from a global perspective, at least, that it is a global step backwards. But you know what? It's what they voted for. Trump is doing exactly what he said he would. He's prioritising what he considers to be America's interests first and foremost. And he is bringing on his Secretary of Health, RFK Jr., who is well known for his views on vaccine and on healthcare. And he is doing exactly what he said he would. And he won the election.
that's the bit that offends me, though, Chris. So that's the bit that I was struggling with watching the Congress today, was that as he said, egregious thing after egregious thing, elected representatives of their communities stood and cheered. Call me old-fashioned, but I would have thought basic human decency would prevent perhaps some of the glowing, the crowing that was happening today in Parliament. It was just undignified, and that's the bit that I think is really getting up my nose. Is part of it is the delivery of some of this stuff, which I know is petty. I acknowledge that, but it is.
Sure.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to just be the one who's defending the Trump administration, because that's not my position. I also think that in our own backyard, for example, we had 6 medical doctors in the political party who voted for the repeal of the smoke-free legislation. And as oncologists and as medical practitioners, that to me is almost an offence which you should be struck off for. You can't vote to liberalise smoking laws, and yet that happened in our own country. In terms of our national leaders disestablishing public health initiatives, is happening in our own backyard as well as happening overseas. And it's happening amongst our own community, and it's happening amongst our own community leaders. In our own country, New Zealand, we had a disestablishment of the Māori Health Authority, which was the Indigenous health authority looking to advance Māori health outcomes. Māori have a 7-year shorter life expectancy than non-Māori, and yet Māori initiatives were deemed to be only worthy of attention within a general structure, which has actually perpetuated that life expectancy discrepancy. And the government, who was fairly elected in a free and fair election, disestablished that. And they did what they said they would. And so again, I think this is one of the dilemmas you have if you're a Democrat, which I am. I believe in democracy. It's the worst of all the systems except the alternatives, that the majority do have a right to rule. And when they say what they're going to do and they get voted in, it's pretty hard to then go and say that shouldn't happen. It is a time to stand up and say, I don't think it should happen, but to make your case, to make your argument, and to show why you believe what you think is right.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I just wanted, without dwelling on it, you talked about the mandate in a free and fair election, but it was the smallest margin ever of a president in recent times, going back for 50 years, and this change of 300,000 votes in 3 swing states would have changed the result. So, yes, technically, absolutely has a mandate, and we're all in shock about some of the things that happened, but he was very upfront. He said he's going to do all this. So I just hope that there will be free and fair elections, the midterms in 2 years' time, free of interference from Russia and Elon Musk, and that that people then are able to cast their vote on whether the current program is a success or not.
So that's not how he sold his win in Parliament today, in Congress today. He had the biggest swing ever seen before. So it's some of that stuff. I think also, he played the political game incredibly well. The college system allows tactics to be used because that's the system that people are working at. It's just like, moving election boundaries at the moment in New Zealand is going on. It's the same sort of game, and it is politics, and I'm not a politician. So maybe we could talk more about what is genuinely at risk, and the fact that there are some very brave people within America standing up, and that we have a duty of care to continue to do some good work in this space while there are other people who are unable to.
I just want to be very clear. I do not doubt Trump's legitimacy as a president of the United States. I think he won the popular vote. He got more votes than he did last time, and he got more votes than his opponent, and he won more states than his opponent. In every way, shape, and form, he won that election. And no matter what you think about the media coverage and the monopolization of and politicization of the media in the US, he won. And I think you have to accept that. And I'm not saying you don't, but I think the alternative to when he lost the last election, and his supporters did not accept that, and they stormed the Capitol and tried to overthrow a democratically elected government. The alternative to the smooth transition of power, the fair and the peaceful transition of power, is far, far worse. So we must acknowledge that he won, and he did. And the challenge for us is to make the case for the principles and the institutions that we believe in and hold dear, and demonstrate why people should take a different course and show whatever your proposition is.
Let's do exactly that, Chris. So I also found an interesting paper from the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, and so that's an important journal in the context of this discussion, entitled as an editorial, "Essential Goal Within Reach, Attaining Diversity, Equity, Inclusion" for the Journal of the NCI. And so they really set out the case for why this effort DEI is important. And one of the most important things is really that, we've seen huge improvements in cancer outcomes in the last couple of decades through efforts in screening, diagnosis, treatment, survivorship, patient-reported outcomes, etc. But there are still population groups lagging behind. And in some instances, those gaps have actually widened. And so you mentioned the Maori population in New Zealand and in our case in Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, and to a much lesser extent in regional populations, the gaps between metropolitan outcomes and regional outcomes, for example, have not been bridged. And the gaps between the First Nations populations and the rest of the country have actually got worse. It's actually been a disaster. So this effort to broaden the inclusiveness on editorial staff and boards, to encourage contributions from disadvantaged populations, to encourage papers focused on research to overcoming the barriers to bridging those gaps, has been an effort by the JNCI for several years. And they're, for example, if any of you have recently submitted a paper, you get asked some demographic questions about your gender, what your ethnic origins are, whether you identify in terms of race. And that data is collected. It's not linked to the submission, but they're collecting that data to try and track whether their efforts are actually leading to an improvement in the diversity over time. So again, the paper is a bit of a call to action and a reaffirmation that the JNCI and the JNCI Cancer Spectrum will commit to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that were begun in 2022, striving to advance the diversity and inclusion of study participants, clinicians, research investigators, community engagement, and investigator leadership in cancer research, encouraging innovative research aimed at addressing and improving cancer health equity to ensure the advances in cancer biology and strategies for cancer prevention, screening and early detection, etc., are accessible and affordable to all. So, we really need to continue the efforts to try and improve the outcomes for those disadvantaged. That will have a bigger impact than it's just chipping away at the top. So in an interesting article, I did notice, in fact, that one of the contributors was Martin Stockler from Sydney. So good on you, Martin, for contributing to that editorial.
So, Craig, just walk me through what the evidence is that improving diversity and inclusion has positive outcomes in terms of health. So when you focus on those targets that improve outcomes.
They didn't address that in this paper. They talked about the progress and in the data they're collecting, but to demonstrate an impact of that program on cancer outcomes would be a multi-year effort, and this program only started 3 years ago.
There is other people's work that they quote and that we're talking about later, that clinician diversity and clinician-patient concordance appears to improve outcomes for people in otherwise disadvantaged communities. It also increases the uptake of cancer screening, the receipt of recommended care as per guidelines. We've already got data to show that more women that you have working, the better your patients do. That's another thing altogether. That identifying as Black Americans who are in a community with more Black doctors have a longer life expectancy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff feeding into that, but that's consistent over time. So we know that people feel more comfortable if they see themselves reflected in the population providing the healthcare, and collecting that data is going to be difficult, but there is at least some work in NAISONS that suggests that you get real concrete benefits from diversifying your population. I think the other bit that's important is that within research, the more diverse a community that you have thinking about research, the more interesting research questions you get, because we're getting research coming from different angles. And, Chris and I have the privilege to work with some mātauranga practitioners, so people who are using traditional knowledge and new ways to solve new problems, and that adds depth.
So, Kate, clearly I don't disagree with you on all of those points, Kate, but I'll just put to you a perspective that, I've heard voiced by others. So, okay, we think that diversity, equity, inclusion does promote better outcomes, et cetera, but hang on a second. What are the intakes to med school these days in terms of gender balance? It's excessively women, isn't it? At what point do we have to say that actually men are an underrepresented demographic in the intake and we have to correct that? What's your answer to that?
So when 50% of department heads, 50% of professors, and 50% of those publications have vaginas, then we've won. And we are a long way away from that. And then Chris just pushed a button there, but we are a long way away from that. So there you go.
Well said, Kate. But yeah, this paper doesn't particularly address how their diversity program has made a difference, but they, as you say, they summarise some of the literature about how it may improve outcomes. I like that word you used about the concordancy between the populations.
I'm not going to let you away with that, Kate. And again, because the distinction between it's important not just to have an echo chamber of a podcast. It's important to explore these ideas. So I'm going to push you on that. So let's just take that perspective. So the time lag between intake into med school and achieving faculty head and professorship, et cetera, is what, 20 years, 25 years? Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you let the gender imbalance at medical school run with that lead time to then actually have it go too far the other way? So how do you actually balance
I don't have any data in front of me, but I'm pretty sure the gender balance was hit in the 80s without assistance, and yet we are still seeing the same proportion of things. So I think there are significant number of barriers.
Kate, I'm going to agree with you. I started medical school in the 80s, and I think the intake was about 50-50. And there's certainly not a 50-50 balance in leadership positions in the medical industry.
So this is a paper called The Facing Political Attacks on Medical Education, The Future of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in Medicine. And it is written by 3 United States academics, Guerra, DeMaio and S3E2, and their focus is actually on sexual and gender minority groups. So although women have been, and probably white women have probably benefited the most from traditional DEI, diversity and equity inclusive programs, it's been a long time since there has been an active push for women. So this paper, the goal of DEI in healthcare and public health is ensure that leaders of healthcare systems value all people equally and that all people can obtain the power, knowledge, resources, conditions, and opportunities that enable them to achieve optimal health. And this requires health workers to reflect the population who they serve, is the argument of these 3 authors. It feels to me like this is the pursuit of happiness, right? So what we want is we want a community where people can safely pursue whatever happiness means to them. And we do not provide that for many people at the moment. Sexual and gender minority groups are at significant risk of avoiding healthcare due to feelings of differences from their clinicians. And many states and actually countries, we are bagging the US at the moment, but a lot of countries have similar issues and restrict the ability of the educational institutions to have DEI efforts. And I won't list those states, you can guess them. Also, legislation is restricting healthcare for people of sexual and gender minority people, including legal action against clinicians providing gender affirming care, including in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as of last week. It's very, very easy to turn the public against gender affirming care and other DEI goals by using language. And that's what Chris was trying to do. He was using his very careful debating skills to point out how easy it is to draw out. So if you call gender affirming care child abuse, mutilation, nobody wants child abuse and mutilation. If you say that providing a space where it is safe for people to be Black or to be Māori, and that's somehow racist against your white colleagues, nobody likes racism. If you say that women have been 80% of graduates for decades, and yet we aren't saying, there's something wrong with women, people are something wrong with the way that men are being treated, people are going to agree with that. I think the language that we use has to be so very, very careful, because people only have time for a soundbite. And the soundbite that particularly, as of the news in New Zealand last week, that gender affirming care is dangerous and child abuse got quite a lot of airtime. And that is a concern for people who are already struggling with accessing appropriate healthcare.
So, Chris, you're causing some chaos in the podcast now. So,
how
about
good.
No. No, so I'm just mindful of the time. So how about you tell us about the paper that you were going to cover, and we can come back to this as a discussion point.
Yeah, no, the one I wanted to mention, which was policy related to what Kate had just brought up, was the University of Otago Mirror on Society policy. So I'm just going to bookmark that and come back to it. I wanted to reflect on the McKinsey report on corporate diversity. So there's been 3 different McKinsey reports, 2015, 2018, and 2020. And it looked at the relationship between diversity in the executive teams and financial performance. And they actually found that the relationship between diversity on executive teams and financial performance actually strengthened over time. And that was found to be true over 15 countries and 1,000 large corporations. So those with the top quartile with gender and ethnic diversity in their corporate leadership teams had the best financial performance. Now, it's quite hard to know which way that causal arrow goes. Is it the most open-minded and adaptable companies which have the greatest inclusive policies, or is it the greater inclusion that leads to better financial performance? It's not clear to say what the causality is, but the association's pretty clear there that those with the best diversity, equity and inclusion have the best financial performance. So if you want to make money, include people. I think that's the bottom line, really, and ensure that your leadership is representative. I think the other thing is anyone who's ever been in a leadership role or chaired a committee or whatever will know the perils of groupthink, and it's important to have a diversity around the table. Otherwise, you get lulled into that and you'll miss stuff. And certainly I've learnt the most in committees that I've been on from the people who are least like me as they've challenged my assumptions and thinking all along. So I've always really valued that diversity in committees and the like that I've been on. And can I just give a quick shout out to Eva Segalov, founder of the OJC podcast, who of course was a vociferous, vocal and frequent critique of the mental in oncology conferences around the world. Good on you, Eva, for always calling that out and for being true to those principles.
You're lucky she's not here today, Chris. I think she probably would have been reaching through that camera and
Oh, look, Craig, I think it's important for us to be able to hold our arguments and articulate them clearly. The Otago Mirror on Society policy is a really good example. It was formulated by the previous dean of the School of Medical Sciences, a beautiful, wonderful man called Peter Crampton, whose overarching view was that the medical school intake should represent the community from which it was drawn. And that meant ethnic representation, socioeconomic representation, rurality, etc. And to say that the med school graduate should be simply a mirror on society. And the beauty of the policy was you could understand it just by its name. Now, that was in place until last year. It's just been replaced and updated by Te Kaue Paraora as well, but effectively it's an affirmative action style program. The thing is, without the affirmative action program, it would take another 30 to 40 years for the medical workforce to look like what our community does. So there are, of course, entrenched privilege in terms of access to education, in terms of access to wealth, in terms of the advantages that gives you, and how that translates to your medical intake. And Kate's completely right. Having a doctor in a community that of health professionals that looks like you increases your likelihood to engage with that. And we already know that Māori and Pacifica in particular have more difficulties navigating the system and even accessing healthcare in the first place. Having a workforce that looks like you is appropriate to overcome those barriers. So I do completely agree with you that the purpose of trying to be the devil's advocate is simply to tease out the truth as best we can here.
Look, I love my job. I have very much enjoyed being a doctor, and it comes with some cachet and some privilege that I know at least some of the young people going into medical school, that's what they're after. But there are always going to be more young people that want to be doctors than we can ever educate and or give jobs. In my day, there was a little bit of a DEI, but it was very small. And they pretty much just ranked us, drew a line, and everybody above the line got in. And I'm not sure all of those people were the best people to be turning into doctors. And so, I think we have to acknowledge that there are you don't actually have to be that clever to be a doctor. There's a lot more to it than just being book smart. And so let's give these relatively new programs a go. And Chris and I both teach in New Zealand, and the new bachelors of medical students are good people. And they are a diverse group of very tall people. I'm getting short with my old age, but very tall young people. They're lovely.
Kate, I feel like when you're talking about the people who shouldn't have ever gotten to med school, I feel like you're talking about me.
Not at all.
All right. So a couple of other papers we'll just link to. The Lancet wrote a paper called American Chaos Standing Up for Health and Medicine. And JAMA, which is one of our favourite journals on the podcast, reaffirming their commitment to health, patients and the public, and really highlighted some concerns about how American predominance in health sciences research may be at risk and the global consequences of that. Interesting, some of the other responses. So there was a lot of journals reaffirming that they would stand tall. I was interested, and Kate, you might want to talk to this, I would say appeasement from industry. So GSK have overturned their policies.
GSK removed their DEI policies from their internet and from their programs, despite the fact they are at least nominally owned and based out of the UK. And, we all know how well appeasements worked for us before. I find that absolutely fascinating, the amount of rollover. And, I think we've talked about this before, but those queue of very wealthy people at the inauguration, many of whom one would have assumed had other political views, now telling us that their boards need to go back to being more masculine and anti-woke policies, and that they've been too soft, and that's cost them money. So I find the whole thing fascinating, but terrifying in the same respect.
Yeah. And Chris, did you want to talk about, we actually reached out to a couple of colleagues, you probably don't want to name them, but we actually reached out to a couple of colleagues about potentially appearing on this episode.
Yeah, so we spoke to a couple of colleagues who worked at the NCI in the US, and my colleagues felt that even their email communications were being potentially monitored, and they didn't want to have conversations even over media channels like WhatsApp, and so would prefer voice calls and the like, which were more difficult. And they didn't want to go on because actually when it came to the chop, which is inevitably coming, they would be more vulnerable for not aligning with the values of the administration. So again, it is that self-censorship that goes on with that, which is a real worry. And one of the things I thought, Craig, that was really fascinating about that Lancet editorial was it referred to the government executive order had said that any federal funded research which uses the words gender, transgender, non-binary, LGBT are banned from being used in any federally funded research. And this is America, the land of the First Amendment, the land of free speech, the land of academic freedom, and you are banned from using certain words in your academic publications. And that is beyond Orwellian. That is a step towards the Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, that's right. It really feels like it's crossed the line, hasn't it?
And just running with that Handmaid's Tale theme, as a woman, I don't need the Trump administration to protect me from queer or transgender people. They are no threat to me. However, the HHS website, which was taken offline by the government and then was made to turn themselves back on again, says the Trump administration rejects gender ideology and condemns the harm it causes to women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, well-being and opportunities. Being a woman rocks. Anybody who also would like to become or has always been a woman and would like to affirm that, you are more than welcome. So just while I'm ranting, I found this quote the other day on the internet. I thought it was wonderful because it is Pride Month over here in the Deep South. Pride Week does not turn straight kids into queer kids. It stops queer kids being turned into dead kids. And so, yeah, and that hits really hard, really, really hard.
100%. And in New Zealand just last week, Kate, you'll be aware of it for our audience, there was a drag king in a library in our capital city who was reading stories to kids that got raided by a church protest who then physically intimidated and roughed up a couple of people there. Kids being read stories in a library. Now, I don't know what the consequences of Dame Edna Everage has had on the Australian population, but, guys
darling,
dressing up as girls,
you'll never know, darling.
Yeah, or girls dressing up as guys. It's why you've got such bad glasses, isn't it? But I really can't see the harm of that. Kids just think it's fun, and an exposure to fun stories read by someone in costume isn't going to upset things. We've had Christmas pantos like that for years. And to me, it's a way of group identification and group membership and strengthening the group membership of a failing and small community and stopping them from dwindling even more by targeting a vulnerable group. But that stuff is really sad, and it's happening in our own backyard too.
The rescue, the wonderful thing in that video, which is available on the internet should you wish to put yourself through it, is at the tag end, the two librarians who came to the defence and kicked these very big, large people, kicked them out of the library. And one auntie actually said, I hope you're happy with yourself, in the best Kiwi accent. So, always look after the aunties, always look out for the helpers.
So I think in conclusion, my take home would be that we're in the privileged position where we can at the moment speak up. So we'll keep speaking up about diversity, equity and inclusion. Papers focused on addressing equity has always been something that we've done on the podcast and we'll continue to do. We'll continue to offer support to our international colleagues. We'll call out overreach, which feels like some of these initiatives in the US are definitely overreach. We hope that the democratic process will decide in a couple of years on the merits of the current programs of the administration.
Yeah, so Craig, I'd just like to share a story of success. So this talk of DEI and focus on equity-based research and focus on equity, etc., they're not just buzzwords, they're not just a political position, it's not just wokeism, it is actually about people's lives. So when I started researching bowel cancer in New Zealand 20 years ago, there was a massive equity gap between Māori and non-Māori New Zealanders in terms of bowel cancer outcomes. Māori waited longer, less likely to get referred for adjuvant therapy, less likely to receive adjuvant therapy, less likely to get intervened for metastatic disease, and shorter overall survival. And over the course of the last 20 years, I've seen that gap shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. And that has been through the systematic focus through Cancer Navigators, it's been through equity statements, it's been through systematic reporting of equity outcomes, it's by diversification of the workforce, it's by about cultural safety and cultural competence training as well, and it's by a relentless highlighting of that equity gap and how it is unfair and how people die prematurely as a result of that. And I've seen that gap shrinking over the course of my career. So these aren't just buzzwords. The problem is fixable. It is not persistent or permanent, and it is not inevitable. And we are in a position to do something about it. And as leaders in our field, when we shine light on the facts and we show a path, we can save lives.
Yeah, I agree. And so little vignette in our own city. We're one of the few, maybe the only region in Australia where we've actually matched metropolitan 5-year survival outcomes through some funding and building a cancer centre through research programs. And so we calculated just in our city, that equates to about 90 lives per year saved. So, in a small community, that's not an insubstantial amount. So, yes, these aren't just buzzwords. These are human lives, 90 people, 90 families, hundreds of friends. So thank you all. And a big shout out to Rachel for giving us permission to do this episode as the producer of the show. So thank you, Rachel, for enabling us to have this GADFest, and let's hope that people had enjoyed it, get something out of it. Please share it and give us some feedback on your thoughts. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again soon for hopefully a funnier episode.
And if you really just want to send really mean comments, Craig will leave his Twitter handle in the comment section at the bottom of the podcast episode, and just direct all them to him, not to me. Thanks.
And I managed to get the word vagina into this podcast too. So
yeah, that was great. See you later.
Thank you for tuning in to the Oncology Journal Club podcast, proudly brought to you by the Oncology Podcast, part of the Oncology Network. For healthcare professionals seeking regular news updates and insightful discussions, we invite you to join our community at oncologynetwork.com.au. Your free registration includes a complimentary subscription to our weekly publication, the Oncology Newsletter, a valuable resource to stay updated on the latest advancements in the field. We value your input and welcome your feedback and paper recommendations via our social media channels, email and website. Your insights help shape the conversation and drive the direction of future episodes. This is Rachel Babin signing off for the Oncology Journal Club podcast.